Picture this. It's 7:23 a.m. on a Tuesday morning in Riverside Oaks, and I'm standing on my grandmother's front porch, watching 847 million gallons of crystal-clear mountain water cascade down Pinewood Drive like God's own fire hose. The sound is deafening, like a freight train made of liquid fury, drowning out the screams from the $500,000 McMansions getting their unexpected swimming pools. And there's Karen Westbrook, HOA President Extraordinaire, standing waist-deep in muddy water in her precious white Range Rover, mascara streaming down her Botox cheeks like black tears of justice. She's screaming something about lawsuits and property damage, but all I can hear is the sweet, sweet symphony of federal water rights being exercised for the first time in 67 years. My name is Damon Rivers, and I'm a retired Army Corps of Engineers captain who just taught an entire subdivision the difference between homeowner association bylaws and the United States Constitution. But let me back up and tell you how a racist HOA president tried to steal my inheritance and ended up bankrupting her entire neighborhood instead. 6 months earlier, I was sitting in a lawyer's office in downtown Phoenix, still processing the fact that Grandma Essie was gone. The cancer had taken her fast, too fast for me to get leave from my deployment in Afghanistan to say goodbye properly. 22 years in the Corps of Engineers, building bridges and managing water systems from Kosovo to Kandahar, and I'd never felt as helpless as I did holding that deed to her lakefront property in Riverside Oaks. "Your grandmother was quite the character," said Mr. Patterson, the estate attorney, sliding a thick manila folder across his mahogany desk. "She left you more than just the house, Captain Rivers. There's 43 acres of pristine lakefront, plus something that makes this property extraordinarily valuable." He opened the folder to reveal documents dating back to 1887, original water rights certificates signed by the territory of Arizona governor himself. My great-great-grandfather had been one of the first black homesteaders in the area, and these papers granted him exclusive water rights to the entire underground aquifer system that fed Lake Morrison. "Sir," I said, my engineering brain already calculating the implications, "are you telling me my family owns the water rights to the lake that supplies this entire area?" Patterson nodded gravely. "Not just the lake, Captain, the entire underground spring system. Your great-great-grandfather was smart enough to file these claims before Arizona became a state. Under federal water law, these rights are senior to any municipal or private claims filed after 1887. I stared at the yellow documents, thinking about Grandma Essie's stories of her grandfather fighting prejudice and bureaucracy to establish his claim. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here I was, a black man in uniform who'd spent 2 decades serving a country that didn't always serve people who looked like me, inheriting water rights that could control an entire suburban paradise. "There's one more thing," Patterson continued. "The property is currently under pressure from the local homeowners association. They've been aggressive in their attempts to acquire it." That's when I first heard the name Karen Westbrook. At 52 years old, Karen was the kind of woman who'd weaponized privilege into an art form. Think suburban soccer mom meets corporate boardroom shark, with enough plastic surgery to set off airport metal detectors. She drove a white Range Rover with personalized plates reading HOA Karen, because apparently subtlety wasn't in her vocabulary. Karen had moved to Riverside Oaks 7 years earlier with her husband Bradley, a tax attorney who specialized in creative municipal financing. They'd bought the largest house in the subdivision, a 6,800-square-foot monument to tasteless excess with fake columns, a circular driveway, and enough outdoor lighting to guide aircraft. Her hobbies included tennis at the country club, where she was notorious for disputing line calls, and organizing charity galas where she'd pat herself on the back for raising money to help unfortunate communities, always careful to specify which communities she considered unfortunate and why. She collected humanitarian awards like some people collect coffee mugs, and her Instagram was full of photos of herself presenting oversized checks to carefully selected recipients. But Karen's true passion was power. As HOA president for the past 4 years, she'd transformed Riverside Oaks from a quiet lakefront community into her personal fiefdom. She ruled through a combination of manufactured crises, selective enforcement of increasingly ridiculous bylaws, and what I'd later discover was a sophisticated corruption scheme designed to force property sales and line her own pockets. I should have known trouble was coming when I saw the white Range Rover parked in my grandmother's driveway at 6:47 a.m. on my second day home. I'd barely finished my coffee when the doorbell started ringing like someone was trying to send Morse code. Karen stood on the front porch in full tennis regalia. White visor, white skirt, white shoes that probably cost more than my deployment bonus. She held a clipboard in one hand and her phone in the other, filming everything like she was documenting a war crime. "You must be the new owner," she said, not bothering to introduce herself. "I'm Karen Westbrook, president of the Riverside Oaks Homeowners Association. We need to talk." "Good morning to you too, ma'am," I replied, noting how her eyes lingered on my skin color just a beat too long. "How can I help you? Let's start with this." She gestured broadly at the house, a charming 1920s craftsman with original stonework and a wraparound porch. "This structure is in direct violation of our architectural guidelines. The roof color is non-compliant, the porch columns are the wrong style, and that garden is completely inappropriate for our community standards." I blinked. "Ma'am, this house was built in 1923. It predates your HOA by about 80 years. "That's irrelevant," Karen snapped. "All properties within Riverside Oaks boundaries must comply with current architectural standards, regardless of when they were constructed. I'm issuing you a formal violation notice with a 30-day compliance deadline." She thrust a document at me, 3 pages of dense legal language demanding I repaint the roof, replace the porch columns, and remove Grandma Essie's prize-winning rose garden because it wasn't consistent with the community aesthetic. "And there's another matter," Karen continued, her voice dropping to what she probably thought was a reasonable tone. "This property has been vacant for 6 months during your grandmother's illness. That's a violation of our occupancy requirements. I'm prepared to be lenient and waive the $15,000 in accumulated fines if you're interested in selling." The smell of jasmine from Grandma's garden mixed with Karen's overpowering perfume, something that probably had a French name and cost more per ounce than military hazard pay. I could hear the lake lapping against the shore 30 yards away, and somewhere in the distance, a lawnmower hummed as the subdivision came to life. "Ma'am," I said carefully, drawing on 22 years of military diplomacy, "I appreciate your concerns, but this property isn't subject to HOA jurisdiction. It was established decades before your covenants existed, and it maintains its grandfathered status." Karen's perfectly sculpted eyebrows shot up like 2 angry caterpillars. "Excuse me, every property in Riverside Oaks is subject to HOA authority. Your grandmother may have gotten away with ignoring our rules, but that ends now." She stepped closer, and I caught the unmistakable whiff of morning wine on her breath. "Let me be clear, Mr. Captain Rivers," I corrected. "Captain Rivers." The title dripped with condescension. "This community has certain standards. We've worked very hard to maintain property values and attract the right kind of residents. I'm sure you understand that some properties just don't fit our vision." And there it was, the first racist dog whistle, delivered with a smile that could cut glass. Over the next 2 weeks, Karen launched what military strategists would call a shock and awe campaign. She hit me with everything she had, apparently assuming I'd fold under pressure like a cheap lawn chair. The violations came daily, hand-delivered by a rotating cast of HOA board members who looked increasingly uncomfortable with their assigned mission. My mailbox was supposedly too tall. My fence was 6 inches over the property line. My car was parked at the wrong angle in my own driveway. Each violation carried a $200 fine and a stern warning about community standards. On day 3, I found orange construction tape wrapped around Grandma's century-old oak tree with a notice declaring it a hazardous vegetation requiring immediate removal. The fine for non-compliance, $5,000. On day 7, Karen discovered that I'd been operating an unlicensed business because I'd helped my elderly neighbor fix his sprinkler system. Apparently, any form of neighborly assistance constituted commercial activity requiring HOA approval and a $500 licensing fee. By day 10, she'd found 14 separate violations ranging from non-compliant window treatments, Grandma's antique lace curtains, to unauthorized water feature, a bird bath that had sat in the same spot since 1952. The breaking point came on day 14, when I found Karen and 2 men in hard hats standing in my backyard, measuring distances and taking photographs. "What exactly are you doing on my property?" I asked, fighting to keep my voice level. "Documenting encroachments," Karen replied, without looking up from her tablet. "Your property line extends 15 feet into what should be HOA common area. We'll need you to relocate your garden and remove this illegal dock. I looked at the surveyor stakes they'd driven into the ground, clearly marking territory that had belonged to my family for over a century. The dock they wanted removed was where Grandma had taught me to fish, where 3 generations of my family had watched sunsets over Lake Morrison. Ma'am, I'm going to need to see your legal documentation for that claim. Karen's smile could have frozen the lake in July. Mr. Rivers, I don't think you understand your situation here. This community operates under certain rules. You can either follow them voluntarily or we can force compliance through the courts. She gestured to her companions, a thin man with a clipboard who introduced himself as Dale Morrison, the HOA's compliance coordinator, and a heavyset guy named Rick who apparently specialized in property acquisition consulting. We've prepared a generous offer, Karen continued, producing yet another document. The HOA is willing to purchase your property for $420,000. That's well above market value for a non-compliant structure. I didn't need my engineering degree to recognize a lowball offer. Comparable lakefront properties in the area were selling for over $1 million. But what really caught my attention was the letterhead on the purchase offer, Westbrook Development Corporation. Interesting, I said. This offer is from your company, Mrs. Westbrook. For the first time, Karen's composure cracked slightly. The HOA board has retained Westbrook Development to handle this transaction professionally. So, let me get this straight. You're using your position as HOA president to generate violations against my property, then offering to buy it through your own development company at below market rates? The silence stretched long enough for a red-winged blackbird to complete its territorial call from the cattails. Dale shifted uncomfortably, suddenly very interested in his clipboard. Rick took a step back, probably recognizing the look of a combat veteran whose patience was wearing thin. Mr. Rivers, Karen said, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper, I'd be very careful about making accusations. This community values peace and quiet. People who cause problems here, well, they tend to find life uncomfortable. The next morning at 5:30 a.m., I woke to the sound of chainsaws. I stumbled outside in my PT shorts and army t-shirt to find a crew of landscapers systematically destroying Grandma Essie's prize-winning rose garden. The foreman, a apologetic-looking guy named Miguel, showed me a work order signed by Karen Westbrook authorizing emergency vegetation removal due to safety violations. Sir, I'm sorry, Miguel said, his English accented but clear. The lady, she pays cash and says it's legal emergency. But these roses, they're too beautiful to kill. 3 of Grandma's champion roses, varieties she'd spent decades perfecting, were already in the truck, their century-old root systems dangling like broken dreams, the smell of diesel fuel and sawdust mixed with the morning dew, creating a nauseating cocktail of destruction. I called the police, but Officer Jenkins, who arrived 45 minutes later, explained that HOA disputes were civil matters, and he couldn't intervene without a court order. He did note the destroyed vegetation in his report, shaking his head sympathetically. Vietnam vet myself, he said quietly as he prepared to leave. This ain't right, what they're doing to you. But legally, my hands are tied. That afternoon, Karen struck again. I returned from a supply run to find a tow truck hooking up to my pickup truck, the same Ford F-150 that had carried me through 4 deployments and countless weekends helping neighbors. Hey, I shouted, jogging across the street. That's my vehicle. The tow truck driver, a big man with grease-stained overalls, looked genuinely confused. Got a work order here, says this vehicle's been abandoned in violation of HOA regulations. Parked in the same spot for more than 72 hours without moving. He showed me the paperwork, another Karen Westbrook special, complete with photos of my truck taken at different times to prove it hadn't moved. Of course, the photos conveniently omitted the timestamps showing they were taken only 6 hours apart. Sir, I said, pulling out my military ID, I'm an active reservist on leave. This is my primary vehicle, registered and insured, parked legally on my own property. The tow truck driver immediately began unhooking my truck. Oh, hell, I'm sorry, Captain. Didn't know we were messing with military. This whole job stunk from the minute I got the call. As my truck settled back onto its tires, Karen materialized from across the street like a suburban vulture. She'd been watching from her front window, probably expecting to see me lose my primary transportation. There seems to be some confusion, she called out sweetly. That vehicle has been parked in violation of our 72-hour rule. Ma'am, the tow truck driver interrupted. This here's a veteran's vehicle, properly registered, and parked on his own property. No violation I can see. Karen's face cycled through several shades of red before settling on a dangerous purple. Driver, you're under contract with the HOA. I expect you to complete the job as specified. Lady, I don't tow veterans' vehicles unless they're actually abandoned. This ain't abandoned, and I ain't doing it. After the tow truck left, Karen and I faced each other across the property line like gunfighters in a suburban standoff. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the street, and somewhere a dog barked at children riding bikes. This isn't over, she said. No, ma'am, I replied. I don't believe it is. Karen's third offensive came disguised as a community improvement project. On Thursday morning, I discovered orange spray paint on my driveway, marking it for emergency utility access. According to the notice zip-tied to my mailbox, the HOA was upgrading the community water system and needed to dig up my front yard. The timing was suspicious. My property sat on the highest point overlooking the lake, with perfect views and direct access to the water. If Karen could claim utility easement rights, she could effectively control access to my land. I called the county utility office and spoke with Maria Santos, a patient woman who'd apparently dealt with HOA disputes before. Captain Rivers, I show no scheduled utility work for your area. In fact, your property has its own well system that predates municipal service by about 90 years. You're not even connected to county water. So this HOA has no authority to dig up my property for utility access. None whatsoever. In fact, if they damaged your well system, they'd be liable for contaminating a federally protected aquifer. That afternoon, I positioned myself on my front porch with a lawn chair, cold beer, and my service pistol in plain view. Not threatening, just visible, the way a shepherd dog shows teeth to wolves. The construction crew arrived at 2:15 p.m., in 2 trucks loaded with backhoes and excavation equipment. Karen followed in her Range Rover, directing operations like a general commanding troops. Gentlemen, I called out as they began unloading equipment, before you start digging, you might want to know that this property operates on a private well system connected to a federally protected aquifer. Damaging that system constitutes a federal environmental crime under the Clean Water Act. The crew chief, a weathered man named Tony, looked skeptical until I showed him my Army Corps of Engineers identification and the original well permits dating back to 1923. Holy shit, he muttered, then glanced apologetically at Karen. Sorry, ma'am, but if this is federal jurisdiction, it's not federal jurisdiction, Karen snapped. This is a private subdivision with legally established utility easements. Ma'am, I said, pulling out my phone, would you like me to call the EPA's emergency hotline and have them explain federal water protection laws? Because I spent 15 years managing water systems in combat zones, and I promise you don't want federal environmental agents crawling through your HOA records. The sound of equipment being loaded back onto trucks was music to my ears. Karen stood in my driveway, fists clenched, watching her third attempted power play crumble like a house of cards. This community has rights, she shouted. Yes, ma'am, it does, I agreed, just not the ones you think it has. By week 3, Karen had escalated from harassment to outright fraud. I discovered this when my water was shut off at 8:30 a.m. on a Monday morning. The county utilities truck was pulling away as I stepped outside to investigate. My neighbor Frank, a retired plumber who'd become an unexpected ally, jogged over with a troubled expression. Damon, they just cut your water line at the street, said there was a court order for non-payment of utilities. I checked my mailbox and found a stack of past due utility notices I'd never seen before, each one stamped with late fees and penalties. According to the documents, I owed $3,047 in water and sewer bills dating back 8 months, well before I'd inherited the property. The smell of fresh-cut grass filled the morning air as automatic sprinkler systems activated throughout the neighborhood. The irony wasn't lost on me that everyone else's water worked fine, while mine had been shut off for bills that didn't exist. I drove to the county utility office and waited 45 minutes to speak with a supervisor named Janet Morrison, coincidentally sharing a last name with the lake, which should have been my first clue about local family connections. These billing records show consistent non-payment, Janet said, reviewing the file on her computer. The account holder failed to respond to multiple notices. Ma'am, this property has its own well system. It's never been connected to county water service. Janet frowned at her screen. That's unusual. Let me pull up the service connection records. After 20 minutes of typing and head-scratching, Janet discovered what I'd suspected. The utility account had been fraudulently established in my grandmother's name, with bills sent to a P.O. box controlled by the HOA. Captain Rivers, someone has been intercepting these bills and allowing them to accumulate. This appears to be intentional fraud designed to create a lien against your property. The water was restored by noon, but the damage was done. Karen had demonstrated she was willing to commit actual crimes to force me out. This wasn't just HOA overreach anymore. This was systematic harassment with criminal intent. That evening, I called my old army buddy Marcus Thompson, who'd gone from military intelligence to FBI white-collar crime. After explaining the situation, Marcus was quiet for a long moment. "Brother," he said finally, "what you're describing sounds like a RICO case waiting to happen. Racketeering, mail fraud, conspiracy to commit property theft. How many other homeowners has she pulled this on?" It was a damn good question. Karen's fifth offensive was her most ambitious yet, and her biggest mistake. On a Wednesday morning, I woke to find surveyor stakes driven throughout my property, marking what appeared to be a new subdivision layout. Attached to each stake was a notice declaring the land condemned for community improvement under eminent domain authority. The notice was signed by Thomas Westbrook, Bradley's brother, who apparently served on the City Planning Commission. The condemnation order claimed my property posed environmental hazards to the community water supply, and authorized immediate seizure for $50,000 compensation. Now, most people might have been intimidated by official-looking documents with impressive seals and legal language, but I'd spent 22 years in the Army Corps of Engineers, including 3 years managing water systems in Iraq. I knew environmental law, I knew water rights, and I sure as hell knew when someone was trying to steal federal property, because that's what my water rights made this. Federal property under the jurisdiction of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. I made 3 phone calls that changed everything. First, I called Colonel Patricia Williams, my former commanding officer, now stationed at Corps headquarters in Washington. After explaining the situation, she connected me with the Corps' real estate division. "Captain Rivers," said Major Jennifer Lopez, "if your property controls senior water rights to a navigable waterway, any attempt to seize it requires federal approval under the Rivers and Harbors Act. No local authority can condemn Corps-protected water resources." Second, I called the FBI's Phoenix field office and asked for Agent Sarah Chen, who specialized in public corruption cases. After hearing my story, she requested copies of all HOA documents and financial records. "Mr. Rivers, if local officials are using condemnation authority to benefit private development projects, that's a federal civil rights violation under Title 18. We'll need to investigate." Third, I called the Tribal Gaming Authority on the nearby Apache Reservation. My great-great-grandfather's original homestead claim had been filed adjacent to tribal lands, and I had a hunch about those century-old documents. "Mr. Rivers," said tribal attorney David Crow Feather, "your ancestor's claim was filed under the 1887 Dawes Act, which granted water rights in trust with federal oversight. If someone's trying to steal trust land water rights, that's a matter for federal court." By Thursday afternoon, I had federal agents, tribal attorneys, and Army Corps engineers descending on Riverside Oaks like the cavalry riding to the rescue. Karen's little suburban kingdom was about to meet the full weight of the United States government. The FBI raid on the HOA offices revealed corruption that would have impressed a Chicago ward boss. Agent Chen's team discovered financial records showing a systematic scheme to force property sales through manufactured violations, fraudulent liens, and coordinated harassment campaigns. Karen and her husband Bradley had purchased 7 properties in the past 3 years, at well below market value, then resold them to Westbrook Development for massive profits. The money laundering operation was sophisticated. HOA dues were being diverted through a maze of shell companies, with funds ultimately flowing into accounts controlled by the Westbrook family. They'd even been selling consulting services to other HOA communities, teaching them how to encourage voluntary property sales through aggressive compliance programs. But the scope of the corruption went deeper than simple real estate fraud. County records revealed that Thomas Westbrook had been approving rezoning applications for properties his family controlled, while simultaneously condemning neighboring properties to reduce their value. The 3 brothers had created a closed-loop system that generated millions in illegal profits. My case wasn't even their biggest score. They'd forced out an elderly couple named the Johnsons, claiming their Victorian home was structurally unsound, then demolished it to build a parking lot that increased the value of their adjacent commercial development. They'd harassed a Latino family with immigration status threats until they sold their lakefront property for a fraction of its worth. They'd even convinced a widow to sell her late husband's workshop by claiming it violated environmental regulations. The pattern was always the same: identify vulnerable targets, escalate harassment until resistance became unbearable, then swoop in with below-market purchase offers through shell companies. But I wasn't vulnerable. I was a combat veteran with federal connections and an intimate understanding of water law. Worse for Karen, I owned water rights that made her entire subdivision dependent on my goodwill. The full implications of my water rights didn't become clear until I met with tribal attorney David Crow Feather at the Apache Nation offices. He'd been researching my great-great-grandfather's original land claim, and what he'd discovered was legal dynamite. "Your ancestor was brilliant," David said, spreading century-old documents across his conference table. When he filed this claim in 1887, he didn't just claim water rights to the surface lake. He claimed rights to the entire underground spring system that feeds into Lake Morrison. The documents were remarkably detailed, describing all water sources, springs, underground streams, and aquifers originating from or flowing through the claimed territory. My great-great-grandfather had essentially claimed ownership of the geological formation that supplied water to the entire Riverside Oaks area. Under federal water law, David continued, these are called senior rights. They take priority over any claims filed after 1887. The entire subdivision's water supply depends on your aquifer system. I stared at the faded ink on a 130-year-old paper, thinking about a black homesteader who'd fought prejudice and bureaucracy to establish legal claims that his great-great-grandson could use to defeat suburban racism in the 21st century. The poetic justice was almost overwhelming. So legally, I control the water supply to the entire HOA? More than that, under the Federal Reserved Water Rights Doctrine, your claim includes not just current water use, but enough water to fulfill the purposes of the reservation. In this case, a working homestead. That could be thousands of acre-feet per year. David pulled out a modern survey map, overlaid with the original territorial boundaries. The protected watershed covered not just Lake Morrison, but the underground springs feeding 3 other lakes in the area. Karen's subdivision was completely dependent on water sources I legally controlled. "There's one more thing," David said with a grin that would have made Geronimo proud. "Your ancestor filed this claim through the Bureau of Indian Affairs because he was married to my great-great-grandmother. Under tribal treaty rights, any attempt to interfere with these water claims constitutes a federal crime. So not only did I control the area's water supply, any attempt to steal my property was also a violation of Native American treaty rights protected by federal law." Karen had picked a fight with the wrong black veteran. The next phase required careful coordination between federal agencies, tribal authorities, and the Army Corps of Engineers. I wasn't just going to defeat Karen's corruption scheme, I was going to destroy it so thoroughly that no HOA tyrant would ever again think they could steal from veterans. Major Lopez from the Corps flew in from DC to assess the water rights situation. After surveying the property and reviewing the historical documents, she confirmed what David Crow Feather had discovered. "Captain Rivers, your water rights are among the most comprehensive we've ever documented. Under the Federal Water Project Recreation Act, you have authority to manage water flow from the entire aquifer system. That includes the right to restrict flow to protect the source." She showed me engineering surveys dating back to 1952, when the Corps had first mapped the underground spring system. The aquifer was like an underground river, flowing from mountain sources through my property and into Lake Morrison. Control the source, control everything downstream. "What exactly does that mean in practical terms?" I asked. "It means you can legally reduce water flow to the lake system by up to 85% during dry periods to protect the aquifer from overpumping. Given that this area is experiencing severe drought conditions, such restrictions would be environmentally justified." Agent Chen coordinated with tribal police to establish federal jurisdiction over the entire water rights area. Under the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act, any crimes affecting tribal treaty rights automatically became federal matters, removing them from local court jurisdiction where the Westbrooks had influence. "We'll be executing search warrants simultaneously on the HOA offices, the City Planning Department, and all Westbrook family properties," she explained. "Once we establish the RICO conspiracy, we can freeze their assets pending trial." But I wanted more than criminal prosecution. I wanted poetic justice. Let me educate you folks about federal water law, because this is where things get really interesting. Knowledge nugget number 1, prior appropriation doctrine. In the Western United States, water rights follow the first in time, first in right principle. My great-great-grandfather's 1887 claim predated any other water use in the area by decades. Under federal law, senior water rights holders can curtail junior users during shortages, which means I could legally cut off water to the entire subdivision. Knowledge nugget number 2, federal reserved water rights. When the federal government reserves land for specific purposes, including homestead claims on former tribal territory, it also reserves enough water to fulfill those purposes. My family's homestead included farming, livestock, and domestic use, which under current interpretations could require thousands of gallons per day. Knowledge nugget number 3, Environmental Protection Authority. The Clean Water Act gives federal agencies authority to restrict water use to protect aquifer systems. During drought conditions, senior rights holders can reduce flow to prevent overpumping and aquifer depletion. Since Arizona was experiencing severe drought, I had environmental justification for major flow reductions. Knowledge nugget number 4, Tribal Treaty Protections. Since my ancestor's original claim was filed through the Bureau of Indian Affairs, due to his marriage into the local tribe, the water rights were protected under federal Indian law. Any interference with these rights constituted a federal crime under Title 18, Section 1153, which covers crimes in Indian country. The beauty of federal water law is that it supersedes all local ordinances, HOA covenants, and municipal regulations. Karen could waive her HOA bylaws all she wanted. They were toilet paper compared to century-old federal water rights. Everything came together on Tuesday, July 15th, at exactly 7:23 a.m. I'd spent the previous week coordinating with the Army Corps of Engineers to install a temporary water management system on my property. Using my authority under federal water rights law, I was exercising my legal right to conserve aquifer resources during drought conditions by redirecting spring water away from the subdivision's storm drainage system. What that meant in practical terms was that 847 million gallons of mountain spring water, normally flowing underground toward Lake Morrison, was being diverted through a series of culverts and pipes directly down Pinewood Drive. The engineering was elegant in its simplicity. Instead of allowing the natural spring flow to feed into the lake gradually, I opened the aquifer access points and let physics do the rest. Gravity pulled 60,000 gallons per minute down the steepest grade in Riverside Oaks, turning an exclusive suburban street into a raging river. Karen's McMansion, built at the bottom of the hill to maximize lake views, took the full force of the flood. The sound was magnificent, like nature's own demolition crew, tearing through manicured lawns and sweeping away fake colonial columns. The smell of wet earth and churning water, mixed with the panic sweat of entitled suburbanites, watching their property values wash away in real time. From my grandmother's front porch, I had a perfect view of Karen standing in her flooded driveway, designer tennis outfit soaked, watching her white Range Rover float past her neighbor's mailbox like a very expensive boat. "Damon!" she screamed over the roar of rushing water. "You can't do this! I'll sue you for everything!" I cupped my hands around my mouth and shouted back, "Ma'am, I'm exercising federally protected water rights under the supervision of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, all perfectly legal." The timing couldn't have been more perfect. As Karen stood waist-deep in muddy water, FBI agents in waterproof gear were simultaneously raiding the HOA offices, the City Planning Department, and Bradley Westbrook's law office. Agent Chen had coordinated the raids to coincide with my water conservation exercise, ensuring that evidence wouldn't be destroyed during the chaos. By 8:15 a.m., the water had reached peak flow. Pinewood Drive looked like a Colorado Rapids, with expensive patio furniture, decorative lawn gnomes, and home sweet home welcome mats floating downstream toward Lake Morrison. The irony was delicious. All that diverted water was ultimately flowing back to its natural destination, just taking a scenic route through Karen's subdivision. My phone rang constantly with calls from neighbors, news reporters, and county officials demanding I stop the flooding, but Major Lopez, standing beside me with full Army Corps authority, politely explained to each caller that I was operating within federal water rights law. "Sir," she told the county emergency management director, "Captain Rivers is conducting authorized aquifer conservation during drought conditions. Any interference with federal water rights enforcement would constitute a violation of the Rivers and Harbors Act. The flooding continued for exactly 4 hours, long enough to completely inundate the lower section of Riverside Oaks, but not long enough to cause permanent environmental damage. As the water receded, it left behind a landscape that looked like a biblical flood had rearranged the subdivision's priorities. Karen's perfectly manicured community lay in ruins, but my grandmother's house on the hill remained untouched, surrounded by her blooming roses and shaded by that century-old oak tree. Justice, as it turned out, flowed downhill. The media circus began within hours. By noon, news vans lined the street like electronic vultures, their satellite dishes pointed skyward, as reporters tried to explain how a single black veteran had legally flooded an entire subdivision using century-old water rights. Channel 12's investigative reporter, Maria Gonzalez, was the first to grasp the full story. Standing in ankle-deep mud outside Karen's waterlogged McMansion, she delivered what became the lead story on every Arizona news station. This is a David and Goliath story with a twist. David has federal water rights, and Goliath just learned that HOA bylaws don't override the U.S. Constitution. Karen, meanwhile, was having the worst day of her entitled life. Soaked to the bone in designer tennis wear that now looked like expensive rags, she stood in her driveway giving increasingly hysterical interviews to anyone with a microphone. "This is terrorism," she shrieked at Channel 5. "This man has destroyed our entire community. Where are his permits? Where's the environmental impact study?" What Karen didn't know, but was about to discover, was that FBI agents were simultaneously perp-walking her husband Bradley out of his downtown law office in handcuffs. Agent Chen had found evidence of mail fraud, conspiracy, and racketeering that would make a mafia boss jealous. The smell of wet concrete mixed with the stench of Karen's desperation as she realized her carefully constructed suburban empire was crumbling faster than her water-damaged foundation. While I stood on my porch watching nature reclaim Pinewood Drive, Agent Chen's team was conducting what she later described as the most satisfying raids of my career. At the HOA offices, agents discovered filing cabinets full of fraudulent violation notices, forged documents, and financial records showing systematic theft from community funds. The HOA had been operating like a criminal enterprise, with Karen skimming money from every transaction. Karen's desktop computer contained email chains that read like a how-to guide for suburban tyranny. "Remember, we need at least 3 violations per month to maintain pressure for voluntary sales. Property at 847 Lakeview is showing resistance. Escalate to utility interference. Elderly targets respond best to health and safety violations. Use structural concerns." At Bradley Westbrook's law office, agents found evidence of a conspiracy involving his brother Thomas at the city planning department. They'd been manipulating zoning decisions, approving their own development projects while denying permits to competitors, and using eminent domain authority to steal properties at below-market prices. The most damning evidence was a PowerPoint presentation titled "Maximizing ROI Through Strategic Compliance Programs," essentially a blueprint for HOA-based real estate fraud that they'd been selling to other communities across the Southwest. But the real treasure trove was at Thomas Westbrook's city office, where agents discovered bid-rigging schemes, kickback arrangements with construction companies, and evidence that he'd been taking bribes to approve illegal developments in environmentally sensitive areas. Within 6 hours, all 3 Westbrook brothers were in federal custody, charged with racketeering, mail fraud, wire fraud, conspiracy, and civil rights violations under Title 18. Their assets were frozen pending trial, including every property they'd acquired through their fraudulent schemes. As word spread through Riverside Oaks about the FBI raids and Karen's arrest, something beautiful happened. The community came together like I hadn't seen since my deployment days. My neighbor Frank appeared at my door around 3 p.m., carrying a cooler full of cold beer and wearing a grin that stretched from ear to ear. "Damon," he said, "I brought reinforcements. Half the neighborhood wants to shake your hand." Behind him came a parade of residents I'd barely met, families who'd been terrorized by Karen's HOA reign of terror, elderly couples who'd lived in fear of manufactured violations, young parents who'd been afraid to let their kids play outside because everything was somehow against community standards. Mrs. Patterson from 3 houses down brought homemade cookies and tears of gratitude. "That woman fined us $500 because our grandson's bicycle was the wrong color," she said. "Thank you for fighting back." The Martinez family brought tamales and stories of how Karen had threatened to report them to ICE over a children's birthday party that was allegedly too loud. Maria Martinez hugged me with tears in her eyes, switching between English and Spanish as she described years of harassment. "Ella es una racista terrible," she whispered. "But you are a hero." Even some of Karen's former supporters showed up to apologize. Dale Morrison, the compliance coordinator who'd helped measure my property lines, appeared looking sheepish and carrying an envelope. "Captain Rivers, I want to return every fine I collected from your property," he said. "I knew what she was doing was wrong, but I needed the job. I'm sorry I didn't have the courage to stand up like you did." By evening, my grandmother's front yard had become an impromptu block party. Someone brought a grill, someone else brought music, and suddenly the entire neighborhood was celebrating the end of Karen's suburban dictatorship. The irony wasn't lost on anyone that we were partying on the same property Karen had tried to steal, surrounded by the roses she'd tried to destroy, overlooking the lake she'd tried to control. Over the following weeks, the full scope of the Westbrook family's corruption became public through court filings and news reports. The FBI's investigation revealed a criminal enterprise that had defrauded dozens of families and stolen millions in property value. Karen's personal charges read like a greatest hits album of white-collar crime. 23 counts of mail fraud for sending fraudulent violation notices, 15 counts of wire fraud for electronic financial transactions, 8 counts of conspiracy to commit theft, 12 counts of civil rights violations under the Fair Housing Act, 6 counts of racketeering under the RICO Act, 4 counts of money laundering. Her husband Bradley faced additional charges for legal malpractice, ethics violations, and using his law license to facilitate criminal activity. Brother Thomas got hit with public corruption charges, bribery, and environmental crimes for approving illegal developments near protected wetlands. But the financial consequences were even more devastating than the criminal charges. The FBI's asset forfeiture action froze every property, bank account, and investment connected to Westbrook Development Corporation. Their McMansion, their country club memberships, Karen's precious Range Rover, all seized as proceeds of criminal activity. The IRS launched a parallel investigation into tax evasion, discovering that the family had hidden millions in offshore accounts and failed to pay taxes on their fraudulent profits. The tax lines alone exceeded $2.8 million. Most satisfying of all, the families they defrauded filed a class action lawsuit seeking treble damages under RICO statutes. The potential judgment exceeded $15 million, more than enough to bankrupt the entire Westbrook criminal enterprise. Karen's attorney, a different lawyer, since Bradley was now a co-defendant, tried to negotiate a plea deal, but Agent Chen wasn't interested in mercy. Mrs. Westbrook systematically targeted vulnerable families, including elderly people, minorities, and veterans, she told the federal prosecutor. This wasn't opportunistic crime. It was a deliberate campaign of domestic terrorism using HOA authority as a weapon. While Karen sat in federal custody awaiting trial, the Army Corps of Engineers launched a comprehensive environmental review of the Riverside Oaks area. What they discovered added another layer of federal charges to the growing criminal case. Major Lopez's engineering team found that the Westbrook family's development projects had violated multiple environmental protection laws. They'd built too close to protected wetlands, contaminated groundwater with illegal septic systems, and disrupted wildlife corridors protected under the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. Worse, their construction had damaged the natural spring system that fed Lake Morrison, reducing water flow and threatening the entire ecosystem. The environmental restoration costs were estimated at over $3 million. "Captain Rivers," Major Lopez explained during her final site survey, "your decision to exercise water rights authority probably saved this entire aquifer system. If their development had continued, they would have permanently damaged a water source that supports thousands of families." The Environmental Protection Agency filed additional charges against all 3 Westbrook brothers for violations of the Clean Water Act, the Safe Drinking Water Act, and the National Environmental Policy Act. Each violation carried potential penalties of $50,000 per day, dating back several years. The tribal government also filed suit in federal court, claiming that the Westbrooks' actions had violated treaty rights and damaged sacred sites near the lake. Under federal Indian law, those violations carried mandatory minimum sentences that couldn't be plea bargained away. By the time all federal agencies finished their investigations, the Westbrook family faced over 200 separate criminal charges and civil penalties, exceeding $25 million. The final humiliation came when Karen's own homeowners association, what remained of it after the FBI investigation, voted to remove her as president and ban her family from all community activities. The emergency HOA meeting was held in the community center, with federal agents providing security because of threats Karen had made against neighbors who cooperated with the investigation. I attended as the owner of the property that controlled the community's water rights, a fact that wasn't lost on the 200 residents packed into the room. Karen, released on bail but facing federal monitoring, tried to defend her actions in a rambling speech that would have been comical if it wasn't so pathetic. "I dedicated my life to maintaining property values and community standards," she declared, her voice cracking with desperation. "Everything I did was for the good of Riverside Oaks." The audience response was brutal. Families she'd harassed stood up one by one to describe years of systematic abuse. The elderly couple forced to sell their home because of fraudulent structural violation claims, the Latino family threatened with deportation over children's toys in their yard, the disabled veteran fined for installing wheelchair accessibility ramps, the single mother charged violation fees because her son's bicycle was parked incorrectly. Mrs. Chen, an 80-year-old widow, delivered the most devastating testimony. "You fined me $2,000 for planting flowers my late husband loved because they weren't on your approved plant list. You tried to steal memories of my marriage for your own profit." The vote to remove Karen wasn't even close. 847 in favor, 3 opposed, with the opposition coming from her tennis partners, who were probably afraid of guilt by association. But the community went further than just firing her. They voted to dissolve the existing HOA entirely and reform under new bylaws that specifically prohibited the types of harassment tactics Karen had used. The new governing documents included a Veterans Protection Clause, preventing any HOA actions against military families without federal oversight. They also voted to rename the community center the Essie Rivers Memorial Hall in honor of my grandmother, whose property had become the catalyst for exposing the corruption. As Karen left the meeting in tears, several neighbors actually applauded. Her reign of suburban terror was officially over. The federal trials took place over 6 months, with Karen Bradley and Thomas Westbrook facing separate proceedings for their various crimes. The evidence was so overwhelming that all 3 eventually pled guilty to avoid mandatory minimum sentences. Karen received 8 years in federal prison, 5 years supervised probation, and was ordered to pay $4.2 million in restitution to victims. Her sentencing hearing was standing room only, with dozens of families she'd terrorized attending to watch justice finally served. Mrs. Westbrook used her position of authority to systematically target vulnerable families for financial gain, Judge Martinez said during sentencing. This wasn't simply white-collar crime, it was domestic terrorism using bureaucracy as a weapon. Bradley got 12 years for racketeering and legal malpractice, plus permanent disbarment and forfeiture of his law license. Thomas received 10 years for public corruption and environmental crimes, along with lifetime prohibition from holding public office. All 3 were ordered to pay joint restitution exceeding $8 million to the families they'd defrauded. Since their assets had been seized and auctioned, they'd be making payments for the rest of their lives. The IRS also got their pound of flesh. Tax evasion penalties and interest brought the total financial judgment against the family to over $15 million. But for me, the most satisfying moment came when the federal court issued a permanent injunction protecting my water rights and declaring that no local authority could ever again interfere with federally protected aquifer systems. Judge Martinez's final ruling was poetry. The water rights established by Captain Rivers' ancestor in 1887 shall be protected in perpetuity as a matter of federal law. Any attempt to interfere with these rights constitutes a federal crime punishable by imprisonment. Karen's suburban empire hadn't just fallen, it had been obliterated so thoroughly that no future HOA tyrant would dare attempt similar schemes. With the Westbrook criminal enterprise destroyed and the corrupt HOA dissolved, Riverside Oaks transformed into the kind of community my grandmother would have loved. The new Homeowners Association, operating under reformed bylaws that prioritized community cooperation over authoritarian control, asked me to serve on the board as water rights advisor, essentially giving me veto power over any decisions affecting the lake system. Their first official act was establishing the HOA Rivers Community Garden on the lot where Karen's McMansion had stood before flood damage made it uninhabitable. The insurance company had condemned the structure, and rather than rebuild, the community voted to turn the space into a memorial garden featuring some of Grandma's champion roses. Frank organized weekly veterans barbecues by the lake, creating a support network for military families in the area. Maria Martinez started a neighborhood watch program that actually watched out for neighbors instead of harassing them. The elderly residents formed a historical society to preserve stories of the area's original homesteaders, including my great-great-grandfather's pioneering role in establishing water rights. Property values, ironically, increased after Karen's removal. Turns out families preferred living in communities where they weren't constantly threatened with fraudulent violation notices and forced sales. The lake system thrived under proper environmental management. With my Water Rights Authority, I worked with the Corps of Engineers to establish sustainable flow rates that supported both human use and wildlife habitat. The Spring Restoration Project even attracted federal funding as a model for aquifer conservation. Most importantly, the new HOA bylaws included strong anti-discrimination provisions and whistleblower protections. Never again would families be harassed for their race, ethnicity, religion, or military status. Never again would elderly residents live in fear of manufactured violations designed to force property sales. The Riverside Oaks case became a landmark precedent for federal prosecution of HOA corruption. Agent Chen's investigation techniques were adopted by FBI field offices across the country, leading to similar prosecutions in Florida, Texas, California, and Nevada. The Department of Justice issued new guidelines for investigating HOA-related civil rights violations, specifically targeting associations that used harassment tactics against protected classes. The Westbrook Protocol became standard training for federal agents dealing with suburban corruption. My water rights victory inspired other veterans to research their own property histories, discovering forgotten federal protections that predated modern HOA authority. A veterans' rights organization in Colorado successfully used my case as precedent to defeat an HOA that was harassing a disabled Marine. Law schools now teach the Riverside Oaks case as an example of how federal environmental law intersects with property rights and civil rights enforcement. My great-great-grandfather's 1887 homestead claim is cited in legal textbooks as a masterclass in strategic property acquisition. Most gratifyingly, Karen's sentencing hearing was broadcast live on C-SPAN, becoming required viewing for HOA board members nationwide. The visual of a suburban tyrant in federal prison orange, crying about the consequences of her own actions, sent a message that resonated from sea to shining sea: abuse your authority, face federal consequences. Standing on my grandmother's porch today, watching the sunrise over Lake Morrison, I think about the lessons this experience taught me about justice, perseverance, and the power of federal law properly applied. Karen made a fundamental mistake that cost her everything. She assumed that local authority trumped federal law, that HOA bylaws could override the Constitution, and that a black veteran would be too intimidated to fight back. She was wrong on all three counts. The smell of Grandma's roses fills the morning air, their blooms even more beautiful after surviving Karen's attempt to destroy them. The century-old oak tree still provides shade over the same porch where my great-great-grandfather once sat, probably never imagining that his water rights claim would one day defeat suburban racism. Military service taught me that bullies only understand force, but civilian life taught me that sometimes the most effective force is legal knowledge properly applied. Karen had money, political connections, and local influence, but I had something more powerful: federal law on my side and the courage to use it. The veterans who visit my property for Frank's weekly barbecues often ask how I found the strength to fight such a powerful enemy. The answer is simple. I didn't fight Karen Westbrook. I fought for the principle that property rights, civil rights, and veterans' rights are protected by laws stronger than any HOA covenant. Every family that Karen harassed, every elderly resident she threatened, every veteran she tried to intimidate, they were all fighting the same battle against suburban tyranny. I just happen to have the legal weapons necessary to win that fight. The story doesn't end with Karen's imprisonment, though. Justice requires constant vigilance, and there are always new tyrants ready to abuse whatever authority they can grab. Last month, I received a call from Agent Chen about an HOA corruption case in Nevada, where board members were using similar tactics against Latino families. The FBI wanted my assistance in training their agents about water rights and federal property protections. Next week, I'm testifying before a congressional subcommittee about HOA reform legislation. The proposed Veterans Property Protection Act would create federal oversight of any HOA actions affecting military families, with mandatory FBI review of discriminatory enforcement patterns. I've also been working with tribal attorneys to establish a national database of historical property claims that might provide federal protections against local government overreach. My great-great-grandfather's successful homestead claim wasn't unique. There are thousands of similar properties with forgotten federal protections waiting to be discovered. The lake still flows, the roses still bloom, and justice still finds a way to flow downhill toward those who need it most. Karen Westbrook is currently serving her sentence at FCI Dublin Federal Prison in California, where she works in the laundry facility for $0.23 per hour. Her tennis-playing days are over, replaced by learning to survive in a federal correctional environment where her former authority means nothing. Prison records show she's been written up twice for failure to follow institutional procedures. Apparently, even in federal prison, Karen has trouble following rules she doesn't like. She's scheduled for release in 2031, assuming she doesn't accumulate additional disciplinary actions. Bradley Westbrook lost his law license permanently and is serving his sentence at FCI Phoenix. His legal expertise is now limited to helping fellow inmates file appeals and grievances. He'll be eligible for parole in 2033, but with $8 million in restitution obligations, his financial freedom will never be restored. Thomas Westbrook served 3 years before being released to home confinement due to diabetes complications. He works as a night janitor at a convenience store, with 75% of his wages garnished for victim restitution. His political career ended with a felony conviction that permanently bars him from public office. Dale Morrison, the HOA compliance coordinator, cooperated with federal investigators and received probation in exchange for his testimony. He now works as a handyman in the Riverside Oaks area, helping elderly residents with home repairs, essentially undoing the harassment he once helped coordinate. The families that Karen defrauded have mostly recovered financially through restitution payments and property value increases. The Martinez family used their settlement money to start a landscaping business that now maintains gardens throughout the reformed community. Mrs. Chen, the 80-year-old widow, who testified so powerfully at Karen's removal hearing, lived to see the community garden established in her late husband's memory. She passed away peacefully last spring, surrounded by the flowers Karen had once tried to fine her for planting. Friends, this story isn't just about one corrupt HOA president getting her comeuppance. It's about the fundamental American principle that justice doesn't depend on your zip code, your bank account, or your country club membership. Karen thought she was untouchable because she had local power and political connections. She learned the hard way that federal law doesn't care about your tennis ranking or your charity gala photos. The Constitution protects all Americans equally, whether you live in a McMansion or a manufactured home, whether you drive a Range Rover or ride the bus. Military service taught me that freedom isn't free. It requires constant vigilance against those who would abuse authority for personal gain. HOA tyrants like Karen are domestic enemies of the Constitution, using bureaucratic weapons to attack the property rights and civil liberties our founders died to establish. If you're dealing with HOA harassment, remember these lessons. Document everything. Every violation notice, every fine, every threat, save it all. Federal investigators need evidence to build cases, and your documentation might be the key to exposing broader corruption. Know your rights, research your property history, understand federal protections, and don't assume that HOA bylaws override constitutional law. Many properties have forgotten federal protections that can defeat local harassment. Stand together. Karen's power came from dividing neighbors and making each family feel isolated. When communities unite against tyranny, even well-funded corruption schemes crumble. Contact federal authorities when local officials won't help. HOA harassment that targets protected classes isn't just a civil matter. It's a federal crime that FBI agents are trained to investigate. Drop a comment below and tell me about your own HOA horror stories. Are you dealing with a petty tyrant who thinks violation notices make them Napoleon? Have you discovered historical protections for your property? Are you a veteran facing discrimination from suburban bureaucrats? I read every comment, and I've helped dozens of viewers research their property rights and connect with federal resources. Sometimes the solution is as simple as a strongly worded letter mentioning federal oversight. Sometimes it requires more dramatic action, like exercising century-old water rights. Where are you watching from? I've heard from folks in Texas dealing with oil rights disputes, families in Florida fighting condo association corruption, and veterans across the country facing discrimination from entitled HOA boards. The tactics change, but the underlying problem is the same: abuse of authority for personal profit. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because next week I'm telling you about the time a Colorado HOA tried to steal a Marine's mountain property and discovered why you never mess with a combat engineer who knows explosives regulations. Spoiler alert, it involves controlled demolition, federal mining laws, and the most expensive lawsuit in county history. And if you know a veteran dealing with property harassment, share this video. Knowledge is power, and sometimes knowing your rights is the most powerful weapon you can carry into battle. The fight for property rights and constitutional freedom never ends, but stories like Karen's remind us that justice still flows toward those brave enough to channel it properly. Stay strong, stay legal, and remember, in America, even suburban tyrants eventually face federal consequences. Until next time, this is Captain Damon Rivers, reminding you that water always finds a way downhill, and justice always finds a way to flow.